Alright, that one, I do delay some Malayan, and didn't have to check the niggy. On Chichi, check go up to my Yawashara Jones.
I just want to start by saying that I'm very happy to be speaking to my brothers and sisters of the Bodhidharma Vihara.
Also, Carration, that also the Chue City, Karachi Lovers in a Chue Lavio, Anju Bene, Churujin in Ma, Yungu Bene, Pa Chepa, the Chupa Gasha, Gan, and Yoma Chubadilla, Bardo Chubasigo, Bardo Church. Says I don't want to cheer like the cross of the Dunga, Dang, Ganga de Passe, and Passe, Sage, and then I do dig you to hear the Church at it, Donald in the Shilsigua. Digo Shigura, that Sana chose a sugar sugar on the Church at it, Donadica.
When we think about Dhamma, the meaning of Dhamma we can understand as, like, for example, if there's a river and one builds a dam in order to stop the flow of the river, to block the flow of the river. This we can understand as being like the Dhamma, which can be used to create happiness. Then one stops the flow of negativity in order to create happiness.
Then Denisa, Dangazuki, Joy, Mida, Semjena, to do a Kadishini, and Chasa, then Mazu Goedi, Gargu wars in a Deva, Louis Devada, and same Giva Deva Kugore, and then Moya the Karaku Marasene, and then Chi Duma the Kukuma, Ganga the Kuku Marwa.
All sentient beings, whether humans or animals or unseen beings, we are precisely the same in having, at a deep inner level, the same basic wish, and that is to experience happiness, lasting, stable happiness. And accompanying this is a wish not to experience any problem or suffering or difficulty at all. So this is something common to all beings.
Dudoi nade, me nade, and the Susorangi, Dunga Seki, Tablamda, and Digituala Tablamdone, and Dustine, Gitina di Tablam Chigurova, the Bijitan Chigurova.
And all beings, again, whether amongst a multitude of humans or animals or unseen beings, engage in a variety of techniques in order to achieve happiness, as well as in order to overcome problems and difficulties.
Dunga Seata, Digi Tugalia, and Tablam, Da Maratone, Da Kashegine, and the Chike, Tsong Yapje, and the Benjur, Tabita, Digitone, and Rangi Ganga Seata, Digi Tuga, Tablamia, and the Benjur Tabisiata, and so Lagalechi Benjur Tabisia, and the Nigi Ajim, and Digitone, and young Kashene, Ajim, Lobsang Dorje. Anjig Leung da, Deni Tolia, Laga Bulia, Leche, Sosu Bencher, Saje, Denia Dunga Seata, and Digi to be a talam. And the Kashina Jigu, Deni Lobsang Shirai made a Ganga Gale, Yamadu, Child, and Jig Bencher Ganga Seata, Digi to be a tablam, Yakashino Kumaja, Michala Kumaja, Denigi, and Denigi tablam, Jinganju, Jitimbi, Jiswanalia, Jiganju. Chasam Yene Mashi Bardon on the Dunga said and the YouTube Donala Dinigiton and on the Tablanda Mara Jigurwa.
When comparing humans to the wide variety of animals, humans really stand out in terms of their greater intelligence. And we use this greater intelligence to try to develop more sophisticated techniques in order to achieve happiness and overcome problems in our lives. For example, we engage in education from when we're young and growing up. We're always trying to learn more, and we use this education then in varying forms of employment so as to achieve happiness and to overcome problems in our life. And this is not always expressed in ways which are good for society. There are people who use their skills and their intelligence and their education in a dishonest way, and they deceive others, lie to others, or even steal from others. But they too are doing so with a motivation to achieve happiness. They're using their education and their intelligence and their varying skills in order to achieve happiness. So throughout our lives, we engage in the cultivation of various development of varying skills in order to enhance our techniques and our methods in order to achieve happiness and overcome problems.
제가 니네 인자다 동아세야 난 디규트비에 탈람 데니기 구마자야다 니네 제반에 디조 탈람 벳 노아레 디세 디가조 디기 요야게 잡려 강아 먹고 동아 먹고 리고레제레 탑람데 노아레스 야고 말레스 거래 안 디멘비게 당아도 총자야다 안주게 롭종지 레가제네 소소기 벤조사지 디규트비야다 강아세야디네 내가 블레 디규트비야다 강아세야디 되수 용 투그르마도 띵기 대화다 띵기가 균에 뱃코랑 강아 균에 매바도 균에 쇠투 말레스 그디네 대화야디 균에 투투 말레스 디 탑람디기 안주게 디규트비야다 동아세 탑람 약보시고 차요 말레스.
There's a great variety then in terms of techniques and methods that people engage in order to achieve their longed for happiness and overcome problems and difficulties. But amongst these, there are those that we would call mistaken paths, and those are paths or techniques rather that society deem to be unacceptable, such as dishonesty and criminality. And these lead to ever-increasing problems. They do not at all lead to a happier life. But the unmistaken paths in the worldly sense, those that you engage in, such as using your education to have good work and to raise your children well, etc., these which too are motivated to achieve happiness and to overcome problems, to a degree, they do that. Yet we also know from our lives, no matter how hard we try, these varying methods and techniques that we apply, they do not lead to a complete eradication of our problems. We do still encounter problems upon problems. And moreover, they never lead to a state of lasting, stable happiness, a happiness that is never punctuated by even a moment of suffering. We do still encounter problems. So the happiness that these techniques that we employ, the happiness that they do lead to, is just temporary, fleeting happiness.
지사 다지소 동아세야 단 디기투비에게 탑람 양다바 차기미도스 지세자다 하나 데레 탑람 야가데 가르두세네야 지게 최제고를 세다 데네기 탑람 최냠는 제고를 세비기 최세야디 안데 지송제 데네야 안데 지 최게 송한 데네기 최냠는 지엔 된바 망보를 중제단 네 점벌나는 나라야 안데 최고 최 안데 지게 망보 중화로와
Recognizing that these various methods and techniques that we have been applying throughout our life, whilst they may make our lives and do make our lives easier and better, they cannot lead to lasting stable happiness, and we can observe that in the world. Therefore, human beings turn towards varying religions, to try and learn more skillful techniques in order to achieve lasting stable happiness.
안데니게 다체 망부예베 나네 아주 낭비게 취 덴바상지 점된데 세야디 다송야디게 취 탑람데 가르 아주게 동아세야나 디기투베게 탑람데 가르 숨고라세네 다 덴바상지 점된디게 아니 데니게 탑람데리아 당보 안지 덴바시 세시 숨고레 지사 율 와라나슬리아 아니 상지 점된디게 덴바시 세 취유콜로 고르제 안정도 동아세야나 디기투베게 탑람디 And
for ourselves, who are included amongst Buddhists, we turn to the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. And here we're turning to the very first teaching that Buddha Shakyamuni gave in modern times is called Varanasi. And there he taught the Four Noble Truths, the most skillful of techniques in order to achieve happiness, not just any type of happiness, but happiness that is lasting and stable and completely freed of any form of suffering or difficulty.
Sanda sangye jumne nige sungye ki denpa shi sayade karasungora sene denpa shi de la dunga ye denpa, kunjung denpa, gobe denpa, lamji denpa sayade on dene ki shi sungwa de.
To list the Four Noble Truths, there are true sufferings, true origins, true cessations, and fourthly, true paths.
Sanda sangye jumne nige karasungora sene ngana zuki digi dunga sayade digi gyudan jin me bala yungu mara gyudan jin chile dine yungu res. Dewa sayade digi ngana zu digi sayade gyudan jin me bala yungu mara gyudan jin la dine yungu res. Chasan gyudan jin la dine digi tubiya de gyudan jin la dine yungu res. Dunga diga gyudan jin la dine yungu res. Ondo sungu res.
Buddha Shakyamuni taught that all unwanted experiences we have, from the slight to the serious, all of this comes from causes and conditions. It doesn't come about causelessly. Similarly, all desired states that we experience, all happiness we experience, this too comes about independence on specific causes and conditions. They do not come about causelessly.
Andine zande pena ngara zuki lüliya anjige subulya naza ji yeba na yeba she ngara naza da ha mogo baina ane naza de yeba ha mogo na naza de garim ha mogo na di naza de ganes yonggu yeme ngara zuki menju she tuya menju je ya tamshi tang ma res 지사 naza de dangbo ngara naza de garim subulya naza yeba da ha go ba che go res naza yeba da ha go so na naza de 간스 용구도 유간스 때는 용구도 돼 나제디 야 메인 가르치는 매바 소고 집에 사탑지야 용고 탑시다 용고로 와서
Let's take as an illustration physical illness. If we aren't aware that we are sick, we will not go and visit a doctor. We will not go and see a doctor. First, we need to recognize that something is wrong. We need to recognize that we are not in our body is not in harmony. We are not in the state that we desire. Only once we have recognized that will we go and visit the doctor and being receptive to receive her advice and apply that treatment.
지상 동화다 하고 마고 봐나 안에 동화도 영에 유간의 실용구 예배다 하고 말했어. 지상 나보 동화디 하고 그랬어. 디네 자 상이 좀는디 나보 가르스 템바시나네 가르스 거스네 동화 시에바라 자스 동화디 당보 제제 하고 와체 그랬어. 하고 그랬어. 동화 시에바라 자스 송거래. 나 동화다 하고 소나 다 니버들이야 동화디 안에 가르스 용구도 유가를 때는 용구도 세비게 야 제바체체 동화 유규대 하고 저거 했어도 나 군중 유대 하고 전에 동화야 유대 매봐서 그래 했어도 나 군중 방어를 자세 동화 유규 군중 유대 동화세도 영화 유대로 군중 대바라 그래 제가 동화 군중 대바 동화 대바게 하고 와지 이 규가를 용도 받제바지도 유 군중 대바다 하고 그래 제가 유 군중 대바 하고도 디 매봐서 그래 유대 매봐서 그래 했어도 나 군중 방어 자세 너도 송아.
So therefore, first one needs to recognize that one is suffering, that one is in a state of an unwanted state of suffering. This needs to be recognized. And therefore the Buddha taught firstly that suffering needs to be known, needs to be understood, not just on a coarse level, but at a deep, subtle level. Once one recognizes that one is suffering, then naturally one will want to know what the cause of that suffering is. And that is the second truth, that of origin. What is the origin of suffering? Because when one recognizes the origin, one will then want to abandon it. And therefore the Buddha taught secondly that true origins need to be abandoned. So amongst the Four Noble Truths, the first is true sufferings, and the Buddha taught this suffering is to be known, is to be understood. The second is true origins, the origins of suffering, and the Buddha taught that it's these origins that need to be abandoned.
그래서 디니게 담보 동아지 하고 와지 동아 셰바 자세 주규라 나주 동아지 하고 와지 나 동아 하고 전에 안에 동아지 교야 규디 가는 시공도 제바 제제 동아 규세디 군주된 바다 하고 와지 디니게 하고 네 디디 군주된 바다 파 규디 빵배 빵용도 군주된 바다 빵용도 나 그디나 동아 영이 그 규디 자원에 매바 수샤바이나 then dunga gyune ya wa mare me ba sa dunga ya yu kunju den ba pang ba na de pang bi pang ba ko tin sa de tarba se to tarba se yu res je sa di tarba se de yo ba na de ne dunga se de za wa gyune ya ma den yi de wa ge din na dunga se za wa gyune ya ma ne ge din na de wa ne de wa jang ya ji den yi de wa de ku res je sa an su le di ju ko tarba se to ku res je sa tarba to ba na ge din na de wa re ane ge din na dunga ya ma re je sa tarba se de to ko je sa ko de 고대문도 자스 고봉문도 자스디 녀모바게 가서 동아의 육군주에 대바 빵비 빵도 빵비 타고 고된세 토고리 니야 토고리 해서 우리 니 토고리 고바세도 문도 자스 숨바들 숨바리 고봉문도 자스 고바는 안 죽길로 톱송바나 되네 기디나 대화네 대화마도 동아 싸우기네요 말해서 되네 땡기 대화장이야 해서 대화 땡부시고 샤바래서 거다
So the first noble truth was the true sufferings, and the Buddha taught these are to be known, they are to be understood. So when here with the first noble truth, needs to understand clearly the sufferings that we experience, not just on the coarse level, but the subtler levels too. Thereafter, recognizing this, one will want to know the second noble truth, true origins, what is the cause of our suffering. And then one embarks on a process of investigating what these causes of our suffering are, and then strives to abandon them. So these causes, when recognized, need to be abandoned. And this is the second noble truth, true origins, the origin of suffering. And these, the Buddha taught, are to be abandoned. When they are abandoned, with no causes for suffering, no resultant suffering will be experienced, because when there is no cause, no result can follow. And the state where one experiences no suffering, where all suffering has ceased, this is the third noble truth, true cessations. And the Buddha taught this is to be manifested or achieved, because a state of cessation, or a synonym, a state of liberation, is a state where one has ceased, a state where all suffering has ceased, or a state where one is liberated from suffering. So freed from, liberated from suffering, with all suffering ceased, one experiences lasting, stable happiness, a happiness that is lasting and stable because it's never punctuated by even a moment of the slightest form of suffering. And this is the state that we long for, a state of lasting, stable happiness, freed from suffering. So this state is the state of cessation or state of liberation, and is the third noble truth, true cessations. And this, the Buddha taught, is to be manifested.
아니 자다네 디니기 타르바세디 아주리게 귤리게라 타고 문두시 제고 저 타르바세디 아주리게 라야라 안에 지게 총접제와 좀 유엔의 계스가요 말이스 아니 아직 현다기 나서려 주 제제 아니连讲 두시네 가이 타르토야 말이스 안에 간스 토고 그래라나 소소기 냠는지요 그래 소소 곰제 냠는지 아니 람 냠는지 곰제 안 토고 그래 꼭된 토고 탈바세 꼭된디 람 냠는지 토고 그래 대인자 이비 시버들라 상여 줌는데 이게 람 곰버자 송을 지사 람 곰고리에서 람 곰는지 곰제 소소게 삼만 땅곰 냠는 제바이나 탈바스 톱도 그래서 지사 탈바 토고리 지사 람 곰고리 탈바 토베기 탑람데다 아주기 삼만 알이야 곰제 냠는지 어두스 곰고리에서 곰자고리에서 람 곰고리에서 디로 곰바이나 탈바 톱투고리에서 대인자 람 곰버자 선 시바들리 송을
liberation or cessation is something that is achieved in our own mental continuum. It's not something that's external to oneself. It is a mental achievement. It's not something that we can buy because no one can sell freedom from suffering. Moreover, no one can bestow freedom from suffering upon us. It's something that we need to cultivate within ourselves. We need to meditate on it, and meditate and achieve it within ourselves. What we all need to cultivate in order to achieve freedom from suffering, a state of cessation, are mental paths. And these are achieved through cultivation or meditation. And these mental paths are the true paths, the fourth noble truth. And the fourth noble truth or true paths, the Buddha taught, is to be cultivated or meditated. And this true paths, these are the method to achieve liberation or cessation.
Dine da sangye jumne di ye sungye di da sangye jumne de khurong dangbo ne sangye chayo mare dangbo ngaro na shi re an nyomo ba da dunga da kanga mongbo ye tin chi chai go re sina sangye jumne de khurong du shine nyamne jeba che chisa dunga se de kane kane yunggo ga dunga se da hao ko wa che an dunga de hao ko da dunga yo de yu ga ne kane yunggu du se be sam ta jeba che den yu di kunju de ba de hao ko da dunga di dine meba so ba na 다 동아디 매바 쇠 투구두에 투구민도 셰바체 다 투구 여바다 하고 네 타르바세 토여 여바다 하고 디네 타르바 토여게 된다라 상여 좀nen데 그런 거 곰잡 람 냠내죠 곰잡 까와만 뭐지지 구두스 냠nen지제 디네 타르비 그거 봐 상여 그거 톱송하네 지나다 상여 좀nen데 그런 게 타르비 토 그런 게 냠용 게 토네 동아 간스 디 간스 용고 디 빠야 간스 제바제 제바 간스 제고도 빠야 간스 빵고도 심비게 또 진짜 제비게 냠용 토네 땅아줄이야 나아줄이 배 닝제자 나아줄이 심전 탐제 동하다 자고도 심전 차산의 디기 주부도 제자 되는 인자 다 되는 도 제고도 세비게 남된디 상여 좀된데 그런기 농아세다 디기 주에 탑렘 그런 거 두치데 냠용이 토네 땅아줄이야 동아세다 디기 주에게 탑람이야 하는 것도 대바시 세야도 송하래
The being that became the Buddha, that became Buddha Shakyamuni, was once an ordinary being no different from us, experiencing suffering, longing to be freed from suffering, longing to experience mental peace, freedom from pain and misery, lasting stable happiness. And as an ordinary being, no different from us, he embarked on an investigation of suffering, coming to understand the cause and the subtler and the very subtle levels at which we suffer. This he would later teach to us as being the first noble truth of true sufferings. After having investigated well what is meant by suffering, he then investigated the causes or the origins of suffering. And this he later taught to us as true origins. Thereafter, after coming to know, to understand suffering, and coming to recognize the causes and the origins of suffering that are to be abandoned, he then investigated whether a state of having abandoned suffering, a state where all suffering has ceased, where one is liberated or freed from suffering, can be achieved. And he came to see that suffering can cease. And this he later taught to us as true cessations. Thereafter, he started to cultivate, to meditate on true paths, developing the mental paths within him that would lead to the achievement of cessation of suffering, of liberation of suffering. So in this way, he came from the state of being an ordinary being, no different from us, gaining experience in suffering, the origins of suffering, that cessation of suffering is possible, and then the cultivation of the mental paths that will lead to the cessation of suffering. He came to gain great experience of this and achieve their final result. And with this experience, motivated by great compassion for suffering beings such as ourselves, he taught the Four Noble Truths.
onda deni zada sangye chumne ni ngarang zuri ya dunga se dan digi tubi tablam di debashi song za dunga she bar cha tangbo dunga da ha ko che ko re se song wa za da dunga de la ha ko ye gi dunga de la gar yo re se ne dunga de la riksum che ko re dunga yu dunga gyu yu dunga chaba du ji dunga se de dunga de la riksum yo re che za ngarang zugi digi dunga riksum bodi dunga yin ba de nga zo ha ko shin ko re de.
Amongst the Four Noble Truths of true sufferings, true origins, true cessations, and true paths, we've heard that true sufferings are to be known, true origins are to be abandoned, true cessations are to be manifested, and true paths are to be cultivated. So to look now at the first, true sufferings, what is it then that is to be known? So it's suffering that is to be known or to be understood. And suffering itself can be, to know suffering, one needs to look at it in varying degrees of subtlety. To do so, suffering itself, or dukkha itself, can be divided in many ways. The most common division is the threefold division. First, the suffering of physical and mental pain. Secondly, the suffering of transient happiness. Thirdly, all-pervasive suffering. And it's these three that are to be known.
Dunga yu dunga sayadi ngarang zulya jik supolya nasa taya dang an jik ngarang zuki jik nima shigo tsiwe na ina tsaiwe dunga shigo kyawe na kyawe dunga dini dunga an jik supolya nasa dang jik ma sheba dang daba dang dini nasa taya ki nasa di ngarang zuka dela dini ki nasa dela dunga dela chowa dela an dunga yu dunga la gore de dunga yu dunga di ngarang zuki Of
the three types, the first type, suffering of physical and mental pain, this is something that we know very well, we have all too much experience of. This is where we experience some kind of physical or mental discomfort, where a feeling tone arises of discomfort or of suffering. And this then can be of something such as when one's too hot and one is therefore a feeling of being too hot arises, or some kind of other kind of physical discomfort such as an illness. This of course leads to the arisal of a suffering feeling tone. And this then is an illustration of the first of the three types of suffering, that of suffering of physical and mental pain, the type of suffering that we are most aware of.
나 dunga yuwe dunga lamna da nga zuge jike da nga zuge jikwa nimedo dumra da dine tholya chamyam ro sosolya des jikara la si digi ya re yang je soso ko zhobo ni dang ga wen wo tu yo de ya jikara la cha re ya soso gi jike le ga dang ga ri se dwan da ya wo tu yo de ya ji sem le ga la cha dine gi jike dewa chi ya chi ro ba dine dewa de la ane gyue dunga le gore chisan gyue dunga re ta nga zuge di gyue dunga yimba da ha go mare nga zuge di na dewa de nga zuge di kya nya do di ji bu ma do de le ya ga ji dewa yo ba da ha go mare chisan nga zuge di na da nga zuge ji den da ya ji ka re ne de ne gi dewa di do no nye je ju ya ge don da la be zu ji go wa chisan de ne gi dewa di gyue dunga so de le gyue dunga se de ka re se ne de le di dewa tembu yo mare la re 지금 tempo me bare 가서는 내가 대화를 해마도 나선 균리고 얘기 마야 귤시네 봐 디제리아 동아리 우레스 지금 다 빼는 거 저기 니메가 알아 되죠 조팅딩 로지 니 대화 지어 봐나 니 대화디 귤 동아리 지금 또 니만아 균리고 되잖아 안디 대화 봐봐 디 동아리 우레 디제리아 동아리 우레스 안 되냐 차와 지구도 쓰는 거 봐. 장로 따지냐 시스템이 차는데 한 대화치 수벌에 지간서 대나라 지금 대화 지금 그랬지. 되네 대화대야 템부요 말했어. 대화 템부요 말해. 규르셔. 인게디 대야 망차바네 한테 차는 그랬어. 차는데 누가 내는 그랬어. 인디나시 저기 조과다 님도 가원이고 투제 당고 통도 빼내한테 차상 저기 바래 따도 까나라 용 대나라 지금 대화 지금 되네 대화대야 gyue dunga re tembu gyuni windi ge mares ne ga sam chilya dene ge tya mang thawa ne dene ang ka che yong res sisa disu chasa gyue dunga re se gorda sisa ding ang ju ge dewa re de gyue dunga yin ba de ha ko ma ga so de di ha ko che gore je
of the three types of suffering, it's only this first type that we've just looked at, the suffering of physical and mental pain, that we recognize and that we already have a coarse understanding of. The second type of suffering, we don't even recognize this as suffering. The second type is the suffering of transient happiness. So this is what we consider as pleasure, what we consider as happiness. So for example, if we have a nice time going out with our friends, or a nice day with our family, going somewhere on holiday perhaps, this is what we in the world consider as happiness. We do not yet recognize it as suffering. Rather, we think of it as happiness, and we think that there is no happiness or pleasure that is superior to this transient, temporary happiness. We need to recognize that this worldly happiness is impermanent in its nature, that it does not last. And it's that its impermanent nature that leads us to a feeling of disappointment, of sadness when it finishes, when it ends. So this happiness, this worldly pleasure that we experience, we need to recognize its transient nature. And it's in all forms, whether we go outside into the sun and we experience some pleasure at having the sun rays on our skin, but then quite quickly we get too warm, so we move into the shade. Then we miss the sun and we go back out into the sun. And like this, we long for happiness that doesn't last. And then we left missing the pleasurable experiences that we've had, hoping to achieve them again. So we need to recognize that all these experiences, these pleasurable experiences that we've had, they're finished. All the pleasurable experiences we will still have, they will also finish. There is nothing lasting or stable to be found within them. We need to recognize them for being transient, for being impermanent. So here, the second type of suffering, the suffering of transient happiness, what we need to know, what we need to recognize and understand here is worldly pleasure is not the kind of pleasure we should be striving for, in that it is not ultimate pleasure. It is temporary pleasure. So we can, it's fine to experience it, but we should recognize it, understand it for what it is.
Dile yaga dewa di zeya yore, jesa di tsimi yi tsimbas mare, jesa dile yaga dewa toya yores, jesa digi da digi du sambega sam di yang rubye ge dondala bezi cheba ina dewa yaga di guni hago li tugu mare, jesa di tsimi yi mi tsamba che dewa yaga di dingi dewa toya ge tablam che go resi go dondala.
The first type of suffering of the three, the suffering of physical and mental pain, when we experience it for even a moment, that moment is a moment too long. We instantly want to be freed of such suffering. The second type of suffering, that of transient happiness, we do not relate to in this way. We see this as being as good as it gets. When we experience pleasure, we long for it to last. And as soon as it fades away, there's some disappointment, and we immediately give rise to desire to experience it again. And it's this kind of transient happiness that we strive for, and we hope will last. We hope will transform our lives and give and fulfill this deep inner yearning that we have for something lasting and worthwhile. So we need to recognize the second type of suffering, the suffering of transient happiness, for what it is. We should recognize, when enjoying it, that it won't last. so that when it comes to its natural end due to its impermanence, there's no disappointment. And moreover, we should also recognize that there is a far superior happiness that we ourselves can achieve, a happiness where all suffering has ceased. And that is a happiness that we can achieve.
And chawa duji dunga se ore. Chawa duji dunga lamna juge sugi pungbo de la chawa duji dunga la ore. Chisa di chawa duji dunga la yon de karsene. Ta de jinye dunga ya ta yu dunga ya ge niga ge tien di karse de so nga pungbo de la tin li ore. Chisa nga pungbo de la tene an de la tene an ma cha ya da za ta ya da bu ji ya da de dunga ya. Chisa pungbo de la tene nga de digi yon wa de ine yu zhuo de ben ni me chawa na la de sitting li ya de an ni me chawa na de dreading de ji le je di li de de ma ta de pungbo de li ya ju ni me ge shu che ta de ne an ji chawa che de yang gang a cai yue gang a. Chisa di na xian da chawa chi du ba zhang lo dang de ben ne yang su bu de li tu je sitting de ji nga ge de xi yu dong a se dewa de li go de ina da de chawa na mong bu de wa ne yang ji su bu de li ya yu gang a ge che jin da de kya be dong a le go. Chisa dong a da yu dong a ni ga ge yong sa ge din zuo de yang zu pungbo de ji go de. 现在碰不可能也不买吧大吧的，也不买吧的。其实你也不买完咱，俺你个经济那个动啊，越动啊，里个，的那咱个就碰不的了，明吃不就动啊那些。其实动啊原来的越动啊原来个，你个原来个是点做是的，但碰的了的那个多啊，是不还我去我来着。
Of the three types of suffering, then, when we divide suffering into three to come to understand it better. The first we've looked at, the suffering of physical and mental pain. The second is the suffering of transient happiness. And now we come to the third, that of all-pervasive suffering. All-pervasive suffering refers to our physical and mental aggregates. For example, our body and our consciousnesses. So these are in the nature of suffering. Suffering pervades them. And the reason that these are now looked at is because it's our physical and mental aggregate, our body and our consciousness, serves as the basis upon which all suffering is experienced. So whether we were looking at the suffering of physical and mental pain or the suffering of transient happiness, all those instances, all those illustrations, those examples of suffering that we experience them on the basis of our body and our mind. So whether it's an illustration of suffering that's very obvious, such as when we're too hot in the sun and then we move indoors to cool down, and then we become a bit cold, so we move back, we put a jumper on, or we move into the sun again. With even something as obvious like that, we only experience those examples of suffering, of heat and cold, because of having these aggregates. In that case, this body, as well as the consciousnesses upon which we experience the feeling tone of suffering. So therefore, all-pervasive suffering refers to our physical and mental aggregates. Kurani dubale tene nga zugi pumpa chabare jesa ditubale deang pamen kurani dubade samtabe ne dingi de pamani bodi pension pa chabege chaksemge dene chaksemge ne ane koni tibaje dene kutaje dene nga zubu tubale jesa nga zugi koron yu koron subu pumpa yu koron le ya ane gye yakasore zabi yu nyomo baleda kasu nyomo baleda
차슴지 뇨모발레tin 주디가 제가 그래서 뇨모발레tin 주디 뇨모발레tin 주비기 제보텔라 아니 약보시 용거 말해.
Why is it then? So we can understand that in dependence on this basis of our body and our consciousness, we experience suffering. But why is that said then to be an illustration of suffering, all-pervasive suffering? Why is it said that our body and our consciousnesses are pervaded by suffering? So here we need to investigate and see what is the cause for us having this body and this mind, so these physical and mental aggregates. Well, we know that we were conceived and born from our mother's womb. To be born from our mother's womb, our mother had to get pregnant. And we know that she became pregnant because our parents slept together, and therefore our father's sperm fertilized our mother's egg. So this we know. And also if we think slightly further back, the reason for our parents sleeping together was due to attachment or desire. So both of them would have had desire for each other, desire to have a child, so they had attachment. And due to this consciousness of attachment, this afflicted consciousness of attachment, they slept together, and what would become us, what we were conceived. Sperm fertilized the egg, and later then we were born from our mothers. So this whole process that led to our birth started with the afflicted consciousnesses of attachment within of our mother and of our father. So therefore this process started from a contaminated base, not from a pure basis, but a basis, not from a mental consciousness that was pure, but a mental consciousness that was contaminated, consciousness of attachment. Therefore, because the stream of causes started from an impure basis, we now have these impure aggregates that serve as a basis of suffering.
데니기 다지상 파면이기 착섬게 제 쿠자 듀요데 안디안 만족에 델리아 남사 부기 차기랬으면 부기 차뱅 해봐요 말 쿠자 듀요데 델리아 넘버 쉐바 주고 그래 넘버 쉐바 슈네 안에 거 미케와 차고 말 넘버 쉐바 마슈바나 거기 철라셔 말 된주고 실로 된주고 봐 그래서 데네자 넘버 쉐바 슈고 그래 넘버 쉐바데 슈예디 나 레지 개왕 아마기 개왕 아마기 레지 똑기 레사 레기 똑기 델리아 쿠타 듀용도 델리아 넘버 쉐바 슈고 그래 그래서 레기 똑기 슈고 그래 그래서 데네자 데 레기도 슈고도 넘버 쉐바 슈고도 데네기 슈네 데네 쿠타 듀바디 바 지게 차차라 신딘 야야 신 내가 저 수부 주요야 돼 데네 차고 그래 지네
Moreover, for us to be born from our mothers, not only was did her egg need to be fertilized, but consciousness, our consciousness, needed to enter into that fertilized egg. For that to come about, a cause is required. A cause is required for our particular consciousness to enter into the fertilized egg of our mother, and due to the sperm of our father. So therefore, a cause was required, and that cause is karma. And that cause is karma.
도 제네 데네 도 삼다 대신하도 동아에 동아 유에 동아 데네 잡아두지 동아 생각 풍부가 삼다 다도 제바 진행하고 다 풍부의 영향에 규가래샤스 도 제도 진행하고 풍부의 영향에 규디 레다 뇽모발레드네 개와 차고래 레다 뇽모발레드네 개와 차고 제자다 아주 풍부의 규디다 레다 뇽모발레드네 개와리도 스베 레다 뇽모바다 하고 있는데 아주 규다 풍부의 동아 대비 규 군주 대바세다 하고 와 차고로
And that karma that we had accumulated that led to us being our consciousness entering into the fertilized egg, this was karma that we had accumulated in previous lives, and this was accumulated also under the influence of afflicted minds, and therefore their karma is contaminated. So what we see here is, for us to have been born from our mothers, there is a process that due to our own afflictions and accumulation of karma, as well as the stream that came from our parents, their own afflictions of attachment and coming together, those two streams joined and came together, and we therefore were born. So in this way, we come to see that the origin or the cause of us having these contaminated aggregates, physical and mental aggregates, is contaminated karma and afflictions. So in this way, we come to understand in greater detail the second noble truth, true origins, that the actual origin of our suffering is contaminated karma, which is karma that was accumulated whilst under the influence or the control of afflicted minds.
제가 당아 저기 레다 뇨모발레티네 깨와 풍보디 동화 차고 지단 강아 영화디 디용고래 제가 당아 저 가르메 봐서 그러서는 지상 저 풍보 깨와 레게 깨와 유디 풍보 깨와 유디다 레다 뇨모바세 코와레 깨와 레게 동화 영화기 풍보 류레게 유디 레다 뇨모버리 딘이디 매봐서 그래 제래 지단 딘이 매봐서 봐이나 탈바세 도고래세 제가 탈베 도고래세 탈바세 디순거 이번 손바디
Here, looking at the second noble truth of true origins, we come to understand that contaminated karma and afflictions is the cause of all our suffering, because it's the cause of having the basis of suffering, these physical and mental aggregates. That was the third type of suffering, all pervasive suffering, the basis upon which we experience our suffering. And it's contaminated karma and afflictions that lead to us being repeatedly reborn in samsara. So therefore, it's our contaminated karma and afflictions that we need to abandon. Because contaminated karma and afflictions are the cause for our perpetual circling in samsara. That cause of karma and afflictions is what needs to be abandoned. And if we abandon them, we achieve a state of liberation, a state of cessation. And that's the third noble truth, the truth of cessation.
람곰 냠는 지에제 안에 삼로나는 봐 삼로다 냠는 지 곰네 녀모바 매바서는 마도 제 매바서에게 답시요 말에 제가 람 냠는 지 고래 사티시 고래 숭 시바디로 하다.
So having come to understand then suffering and the basis for all our suffering, we then, which is the first noble truth, we then looked at more detail at the origin of our suffering. And the origin of our suffering was contaminated karma and the afflictions. And so that's the second noble truth, true origins. We then understood that if one breaks that cycle, abandons the afflictions completely and the karma that it accumulates, suffering will cease. Our uncontrolled rebirth in samsara will cease. And that's the third noble truth. And here, when one looks in more detail of the two, afflictions and karma, it's the afflictions that lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma. It's due to minds being afflicted that karma that is accumulated is contaminated. Therefore, of the two, it is the afflictions that need to be abandoned. And how then to do so? How to abandon the afflictions and thereby achieve true cessations? This brings us then to the fourth noble truth of true paths. Afflicted minds are consciousness. To abandon them, we have to transform our consciousness. We have to change our way of thinking. We have to develop a way of thinking that where first the role of the afflictions is reduced, and later the afflictions are completely eradicated. This we need to do. And this is entirely a mental process. We need to change our way of thinking through altering our external world, the material world. This will not lead to a complete transformation of our inner world, our way of thinking. Rather, we need to develop mental paths. And this is the fourth noble truth, the cultivation of true paths.
Just ngāzu gu dunga se dilia ngāzu negap gi ngāzu lule nāza da dinu so di menju chea da treden chea da na khala ge se ju treden chea da luje da dine gi thone negap gi ngāzu dunga se gi ma do tingi mewa se thoya ma di dia ngāzu bi ju ngāzu tablam that's ne ngāzu dunga se ya di so ngāzu la lan da gu go re menju chea le an ji ge se ju gi thone re an treden chea da luje da di sha sang ngāzu gi negap dunga se ya ngāzu bi ju 라렌 따고 그래. 땡기 대화 뭐 땡기 대화 자원에 다디 아주 면제제야단 최대제야단 류제디기 아주 땡기 동화 균에 자원 매봐 쇠두고 말해. 아니 되게 땡기 대화 죽두고 말디기. 다 땡기 대화 죽여다. 자와 동화 자원이 매봐 쇠야라 다 남냠는 제야 되지. 지상 안 주기 동화 매봐 쇠야라 땡기 자원이 매봐 쇠게 탑람들 남냠는 제야 돼. ane nega pine digi lam nyamlen chebana dunga seya dan digi tuya ngore an dele de dan nyomdo nga zugi sechu dan treden da menje cheya de dini ge thone nga zu nyamlen che ngore jere.
To make an illustration, if we are ill, we should go to a doctor. And when the doctor has examined us as well, she will advise some medical treatment to undergo, which may include taking some prescription medication and may involve some lifestyle changes, such as changing our diet, maybe doing more exercise, and so forth. And we should follow that advice. This is required. But we also know that whilst following the advice of a skilled medical practitioner may well lead to healing, it will not be able to overcome all our problems and difficulties across our entire life completely. In order to transform ourselves and to overcome suffering completely, we need to transform our way of thinking. So whilst relying on the material world and acting in skillful ways, we need to put more energy into transforming our way of thinking. Because it's only through transforming our way of thinking that we can entirely overcome all forms of suffering. And this is the fourth noble truth, that of true paths, where we cultivate specific mental paths or ways of thinking, transforming harmful ways of thinking and cultivating beneficial ways of thinking. This is the meaning of the fourth noble truth, true paths.
남 냠len 제주 안주게다 간에 삼 냠len 제야데 아주 삼로 다제 삼로 나래야 교와 다시 냠len 제야 남 냠len 제야데 셈비게 삼로 나래야 삼로 다제 삼로 나래 비스 아주 셈도 교와 당고 그래 제산당 아주 셈 나라 카리오스네 대차 공로 마야 마리바세야다 세나세야데 디디 뇽모버릭 망고요 안 디수 차상 아주 누워요 유체고래 나 디수 차상 매봐서 그래 지난디 좀 매봐서 해봐라 당한도 당보 가르삼 당구리 라비어도 당한 저기 베네 저기 공조学吧나 공조 사바이나 니기 안에 칸에 봐 지수 셰봐 류주권에 동근 넘경안 받된바 안에 지금 류주권에 샹리아 안에 소저바다 녀다 다야라서 봐 니네기 차고 니네치도 소소 디소 샹라 강에 지고 소소야 강하고 그래 소소 디바세 사고 레앙안 바세 사고 그래지 디바 되네 제당 아유권에 균제 셰바다 안에 지금 류주권에 샹리아 제바다 안에 지금 구마고야라서 봐더니 니네 삼다는 아주 개와 미개와서 차고 그래서 지산 디수 차상 아주 매봐서 그래서 디수 차상 삼리톤에 유화단에 매봐서 그래서 다 냠는 제시를 남 냠는 제고래서 삼리톤에 아주 삼로단지 삼로 유화단지 매봐서 그래지 그래.
Way to gain freedom from suffering, to bring a complete cessation to suffering, is to transform our way of thinking, to develop virtuous mental paths. This is the only way. We do so whilst relying on relating skillfully to the material world, but with an emphasis on transforming our way of thinking. Transforming our way of thinking means transforming the way we respond to experiences in the world, transforming the way we relate to people and events in the world and circumstances in the world. So here we need to recognize the faults of the many of the afflicted minds, that the afflicted minds are the cause of suffering. So what is meant by this this general term of afflictions or afflicted minds? They are consciousnesses which are afflicted, such as attachment, anger, pride, jealousy. There's a vast array of minds which are not virtuous, which are not wholesome. These are afflictions. Again, and we need to then recognize the harm that they play in our life, as well as in the lives of others, and not just this life, but future lives too. So to take amongst those, such as attachment, anger, pride, and jealousy, to take anger as an illustration. When anger arises within us, immediately it destroys our own mental peace. Immediately we are unhappy. And then if we express it to others, whether through a facial expression or through our way of speaking or through physical behavior, we destroy the peace of others. We can engage in arguments or physical altercations with others. And moreover, it leads to ongoing residue of unhappiness within us, such as resentment towards others. So we see from the arisal of an affliction within us, such as anger, not only does it destroy our own unhappiness, but its expression leads to unhappiness for others. Moreover, it leads to the accumulation of negative karma, which will ensure not only suffering in this life, but suffering in future lives as well. So therefore, the afflictions lead to suffering for ourselves and others in this life and future lives. So this needs to be recognized, that these afflictions, the cause that keeps us bound within samsara, leads to suffering for ourselves and others in this and future lives. And it's these we need to abandon, and to abandon them, being consciousness, we need to transform our way of thinking. This is how we can abandon the afflictions completely.
Dene inza da nga zuge lam nyamlen chede dangbo khoran nga su samlo na la kare ku ku resne an deshi shebane dunga kunju se de cheza da dunga de le tarbege kunjung le da nyomo pangbe tarba se de tobudu sanbege tarba do di mathone de tabmin tarba da le da nyomo pangbe pangba tarba se de tobudu sanbege donyegi dubach kore da di dumbade The
training of our way of thinking, developing our way of thinking so as to abandon the afflictions, this is the fourth noble truth of true paths. To be able to have the required energy to train our way of thinking, we needed to have already thought well about suffering, the origin of suffering, and that cessation from suffering can be achieved, those first three noble truths. And independence on giving rise to a strong yearning to achieve a state where all suffering has ceased and where one experiences lasting, stable happiness. So in other words, giving rise to independence on giving rise to a yearning to achieve the third noble truth, true cessations. One will then have the required strength of mind to engage in the training to transform our way of thinking.
Dene nga zuge karkore lamna nga zuge jige lunga yisum ge dembege nga zuge pene khane pa tsudu she ba da lugi shanle ya anji ko kuma ku ya da shanle ya nyobi ye de karjung go so so sammo kuno chue ba na nge shanle di ji shigin sambe kuno chue na andi shi go re khane ba tsudu de ya da ne kuma ku yin chala ku kuma jagin sambe kuno yo na lugi go ne ku go samlo na kuno de ku ji ku me sambe samlo chue na kuno me na subu de ro je kuma ku ya se ma re ane nga zuge 직접 대신에 군주 직매 선배게 삼로치 맨 삼로치 해봐이나 군주 지리 군로 매봐이나 칸바 직접 군주 된저야 말 매반자 나 주기 셈송야디 게 첨보시고 자고 지산 되는 인상 안 주기 내ring이 릉아이 탈바 토구도 탈바 토비야라 아니 개와사고도 디버방고도 지산 개와사 디버사데 릉아 예수님 예주 제반의 디바레 지산 디방고도 지산 되는 인상이 릉아 예수님 요건에 샬라 뇌비게 자와사 싸우기는 지금에 선배기 수름 송해의 예치 뭐 주차고 나저 제가 류유고 나고 내 현리에 규주시하다 측수시하다 작선시하다 미국허다에 싸우기는 지금에 선배 삼다다 류유고의 현 미다 샘전 간의신의 코르유를 찾아는 뇌비기려서 싸우기는 지금에 선배기 삼류토네나 샤리야 안두자다 배 징한바 삼로 두자 땅에 선배기 진짜 류가 이웃음유권에 샤라 뇌비게 자와 싸우기는 지금에 선배기 땅에서 송해디 니기 신부 차고 진짜 주름 송해야 세 니기 신부 주 차고래
So, as I've just presented in the previous segment, this is how the Four Noble Truths work together. That in dependence on the training, in our reflecting, coming to understand the previous one, the latter one will arise ever more strongly within us. Also, what we need to recognize within us is that the goal is to transform our way of thinking. And another way we can express this is that all our activities, whether physical or verbal, come from a way of thinking. They are motivated by our minds, our consciousnesses. So for example, someone who steals, every time they steal, they are motivated to steal. They have an intention to steal. Or if we speak harshly, there is an intention to speak harshly to others. So all our behavior, physical and verbal, whether it is beneficial or harmful, comes from our way of thinking. So this I mention again to emphasize the need to take responsibility for our own minds through recognizing that to achieve freedom, cessation of suffering, freedom from suffering, we need to abandon our afflictions. To abandon our afflictions, we need to transform our way of thinking. This is our primary objective. So therefore, we need to take responsibility for our own minds, take responsibility for our own way of thinking. And this is done through independence on these reflections, making a commitment not to bring harm to others through our physical behavior, our way of physically interacting with others, also through our verbal behavior, our way of speaking to others, our verbal communication with others. And that this way, our way of interacting with others, comes from a motivation, a mental process. So in particular, we need to commit to guarding our mind and ensuring our mind isn't under the influence of afflictions such as attachment or anger or pride or jealousy. And through making this commitment not to come under the influence of the afflictions and to relate to others physically and verbally in a way freed of an afflicted motivation, this leads to the accumulation of virtue, of positive karma, of wholesome karma. And this is an incredibly important point.
미네바자단 가리 제번 내가 현리에 팬비기 자와로 제게디 먹고 차고래 진짜다 우시한 유구모 먹고 류유고니 현 유구모 먹고 와다 먹고 완전 현래 미네바 아니 구모 구고는 현래 는 디기 견전 소소리나 강아지고로 진짜 구모 먹고 와는 현래 미네바 라라에 마디오 미수이나 어디 미디 정보여다 미디 구모 구고 말에 미디 준식 말에 미하고 여러 미디 지게 상부 판도 지기를 선비기 미네 뛰어갈래도 소소나 디기리고로 진짜 디니자 디니게 삼로디가 저기 배기디네 두치네 삼로 야네 다다wen 삼로디까지 누구 숙처처 루고래 진짜 누구 숙처처로도 소주기 상비 삼로디 야야로 누기 지대 냠는데 야루고 봐 진짜 이 예치 뭐 유차고래
Through repeatedly making this commitment not to harm others at all, in particular through ensuring that our mind is not one of a mind that is afflicted, so ensuring that our attachment doesn't arise or anger doesn't arise towards others. In this way, we can fulfill this commitment not to harm others. And as we become more habituated to making this commitment, and our sincerity in that commitment grows, we will see a change in our behavior. Or to express this differently, through taking responsibility for our own way of thinking, we will start to transform our way of thinking and thereby transform the way we speak to others and the way we act towards others. We will start to see we are become more honest in our way of communicating to others, more trustworthy. We will more willingly want to help others. We will want to ease their burden of difficulty and pain, and we will not want to take advantage of others or act in a dishonest way at all, because we value others more. And through valuing others more, we will have harmonious relationships with everyone. Others will see us as trustworthy, as reliable, as dependable, and will want to be with us, and joy will arise within them whenever they even think of us, let alone meet us. And as we see this transformation within ourselves through taking responsibility for our own minds, happiness will grow within us. Our mind will be more at peace, more at ease, and we will see that we're having a beneficial impact on others. We're easing their burden of suffering. We'll see that when they are particularly afflicted, that their mind calms in our presence. And as we start to gain more skill in taking control of our way of thinking, and we start to experience ever greater benefits of doing this, we'll be motivated to make ever further endeavors to take responsibility for our way of thinking. And this will lead to a strengthening habit of being mindful of our way of thinking and our way of interacting with others.
다 니바 딜랑한서 삼라 가르당 고래 삼라 가르치 한국 고래람나 다 동회 셈바세 자야래 소수기 다 변조라 당 된 니바다 같이네 셴리아 펜비게 자와 셴이 셴 동아세다 셴 디기 두야리아 아니야 권조를 초프야리아 당기 삼비게 데스 삼마다야라 네 소수기 아지 셴 지게 롭종다 데니게 마신어서 소수기 롭종 신외的 롭종的이 베지다 혼절이야 펜베질량이 콘도 롭종 지기 삼베 삼다야 소수 리유 권에 나 로봇이야 된디와 지금 가셔 수다 제ля가다 되는 소수 리유 권에 나 소수기 리유 니도 과정에나 시한리야 펜버투야리야 니딩이 베지 땅이 삼베게 된데 동에 삼바 자야 뱀마시 개치모 제거래 니게 개화차거래 아니 나 저기 니 독초데 세나시거래 소수가 니 지금 샹레 지금 세나 제바이나 아니 나 저기 아니 디게 강하면 뭐 연구를 해체래 그래서 내가 저기 소수기 유변조에 나라야 권초를 추피에 다시 교를 로체기 세베 삼라다야 아니 소수기 시인토네 요변에 시인디게 샹레 발랍지 샹리야 심마싱은 좀 랍지 콘솔로 로치기 세베 삼다야 소수기 리기도네 뉴슈다 데니 토네 샹이 지강아 요바 강아세야다 데니 비셰다 당기 세베도 삼다야디 삼로디고 두 차웨네 진비 냠네시 월디 삼로디까지 뉴버 슈체요 바이나 소수기 고갑라나 된시알레 로봇이 두그래 장에 지기메다 지기지메 세나 요바이나 소설야 지기까지 요베나 니강아 슈체딩에 주요네 믹시다데 오데니제 사지 조샤마도 고 로봇이 강아세 두 강아 로봇이 제투로 말 되네자 강아세 두고 말 제자를 소수기도 셈바 자와이나 아니 소수기 뉴바 벤조다 소수기 디노 고갑라디 다다 로봇이 두고 제 로봇이 두고 줘야 로봇이 바네 셴 페바 셴이 두마세 셴레 디기요아 셴레 디기노 소수이네 아당이 될 판바도 빼하고 좀 셈베셈레야 디기요아 차고래 엔 미션다이나 오다디 미 야고요다 미디기 로치기리 만주 벤조 코로나 벤조네 벤조노 로치기 시인터네도나 로봇치기리 안 코로나 지금 수부트네 레가다데 베 로봇치기서 미차사게 뛰어나야다 디 용고로 제네 데네자 데네게 삼로 장고야디 팀비 냠렌사디 디차야디 벤마스 계침부 차고래.
The first general section of our mental training is to take responsibility for our way of thinking and ensure that we do not come under the influence of the afflictions because of the harm it brings to ourselves and others. The second part of the training is to consciously develop virtuous ways of thinking, beneficial ways of thinking. In particular here, we think of the mind of generosity. So the mind of generosity is literally the wish to give. And here we understand giving very broadly. But of this expression, wish to give, it's in particular the term, the wish, that is important. The desire, the wish to give to others. And we understand giving to others as being of benefit to others. So the first part of the training was to cultivate the determination and the mindfulness not to bring harm. The second is to cultivate the determination to bring benefit to others. In the first part of the training, we commit to not harming others through our body, speech, and mind. And the second part of the training is to commit to benefiting others through our body, speech, and mind. So here, we develop the wish to bring benefit into the lives of others, to ease their burden of suffering, to bring joy and pleasure into all those that we directly as well as indirectly encounter. And here, when we think of generosity, we think of it in a very broad sense, not just material giving, although that is needed, but the skills and qualities that we as individuals possess. We use our qualities such as to be a friend to others, to give our time to others, to listen to those who need to speak to someone, to be warm and with those warm and kind to those who are experiencing difficulties. And where we have particular skills through our education and our life experience, we use this to guide others, to give advice to others. These are all ways of practicing generosity to others, of expressing the wish to give to others, expressing the wish to be of benefit to others. And the more we train our ways in this way of thinking, we will start to notice how many opportunities there are to be of benefit to others. And when we notice these opportunities, we will readily take them. Moreover, we'll start to seek out these opportunities to be of benefit to others. And in this way, we further transform our way of thinking and thereby transform our lives. We start to live a life that is not self-centered, but is rather other-focused, focused on the well-being of our community, focused on the well-being of all those that we encounter. So this then is the second way to take control and responsibility of our mind. Firstly, we ensure we don't bring harm to others through ensuring that the afflictions of anger and attachment and so forth don't dominate us. And secondly, we develop a way of thinking to be of benefit to others.
제가 류가 유스미고네 샬라 네베 자와사 자와긴 징메 선배 삼로데 야네 양도다 데네 안데지게 류 롱주 소수게 시인 토네 샬리야 가제 팔버주데 두기 선배게 삼로데 야네 양도다 다 숨바데르 세베 냠네시와 지자 샤이기 소수리아 강아데 네바키베네 파 콩랑나노 랑메 소수리아 콩랑나데 제베네 파리아 콩랑랑메 선배 삼로데 야네 양당고 파 콩랑지 네베기메 선배 콩랑메 선배게 삼다 야네야도 삼다 디쇠보고 마시고 지자 데네 인자 저기 니 숨바디 샤고레 세베 냠네세.
We've looked at two trainings. The first then is a commitment not to bring harm through our body, speech, or even way of thinking. And the second is to be of benefit to others, to give of ourselves, whether materially or emotionally, or our varying skills, to others through our body, speech, and mind, our way of thinking. Then thirdly is to develop a mind that is patient. And patience in particular means that a mind that stays undisturbed, that doesn't come under the influence of the afflictions, that keeps the welfare of others at the forefront of our intention, no matter what we encounter. So this is the third training, to develop an attitude of patience.
소수기 진비게 삼다야다 쇠바숨데 배 야고레샤 선배 데니기 야고 디수냠는 제배 야고레샤 등이디 무드니지 선배 삼다야다 시행에 기회 자와다 되니게 제 시행을 직접에 빼 약고르셔 되니게 등이 무디니 지기 선배게 되니게 델리아 가호kom제 무디니 제게 된 삼바들아 줄이시고 디냐면 그디나 디가서 삼당고 거래.
So the first training was being ethical, the determination not to bring harm. The second was being generous, giving of ourselves to others. The third training was of patience, in developing our mind so that it stays undisturbed no matter what adversity we encounter. And fourthly is a training of joyous perseverance. So here we look at our spiritual development, we look at the progress we're making in our mental transformation, and we generate delight in this. Delight in our spiritual development, delight in the positive impacts that we're having in the lives of others, and we strengthen our determination to continue with our spiritual development, to be of ever greater benefit to others, to ensure ever more so that we don't bring harm into the lives of others. So this is the fourth training, that of generating joy in our spiritual development and committing to continue to strive in our spiritual development.
나데네 안중에 다데소 냠는 제제 디 삼당위 디 강려야 당한주기 띵이지 삼정기 세대 띵이지 신년 주의에게 계치 못 하고 셈 제시도 잠바다 시신된지 셈 남면 왕도 마송하지 율레 제시도 네베 띵이지 신년 주의야 안에 지 배순지 오래지래.
A fifth training is that of single-pointed concentration. One develops one's mind in a powerful, concentrated manner through utilizing mindfulness and introspection. This too is important.
신에게 냠는 띵이지 냠는 매바이나 되샤시다 디모숨 매바스 두고마 제가 되네 장아주 디숨 매바 쳐발라 저다 띵이지 신여 두고 거래지래.
And the reason that single-pointed concentration is of such importance, or shamatha is of such importance, is because of the many afflicted minds that one has. These can be condensed into three: attachment, anger, and ignorance. In order to be able to eradicate them completely, one needs to develop single-pointed concentration and the mind of special insight or meditative insight. These two powerful minds are essential in order to be able to completely eradicate our attachment, anger, and ignorance.
내가 저기 시럽기 냠는 새 그거를 지난 다음에 또 시럽해야 돼. 그 제바체제 다시제 제바체 다음에 봐도 비시랍세야 되고 디냠네 지워들 두바들 시럽기 냠네세 다음에 봐도 비시랍세야 돼.
The sixth training then is to train ourselves in cultivating of wisdom. To cultivate the many types of wisdom, but the wisdom here is that of recognizing selflessness. And this is selflessness is recognized through utilizing analytical reasoning to analyze and investigate reality, coming to realize selflessness.
지사당한 저기 디무세야 될이야 녀모바 용약에 저기 귀디 디무세야 돼. 녀모바 차사 용약에 귀디 되샤시다 디무스를 리고래. 되샤시다 디무스미 나네다 되샤다 시다니디 가월에서 디무세야 될 기고래. 지사 다 녀모바 저 용사게 저 귀디 디무세야 차고래. 지사 디무디 아주 매바서 고래. 디무디 매바서야라 안내가서 셰랍냠네 저 셰랍냠네 제 근데 저 띵에지 신에 딩이 송지기 토네 근데 안에 디무세야 매바서 고래.
A moment ago I mentioned that the many afflicted minds that we have can be condensed into three: attachment, anger, and ignorance. But if one goes to their very root, what is the one afflicted mind from which all the others come? That is ignorance. Ignorance is the root of all the afflicted minds, it's the root of all our suffering, and it is the cause for us remaining bound in the suffering realms of samsara. So this is what we need to abandon. ignorance. Ignorance is a consciousness. To abandon this consciousness of ignorance, we also need a consciousness too, a consciousness that is completely contrary or opposite to ignorance, and that is a consciousness of wisdom. Wisdom realizing selflessness. And in order to cultivate this consciousness of wisdom, we need not only to engage in investigation, but we need to do so on the basis of a powerful concentrated mind, of single-pointed concentration and meditative insight. Then our wisdom will be powerful enough to completely eradicate ignorance, to cut this root of our suffering and gain freedom.
가서 면로 쉬어베나 인디기 나절리 팽기여 바다 팽기 매바다 하모가 되라 맞지 디무시로 디무시 제가 되네기 변에 자야로 집이 메인디 다 팽기 수불 느기 예배 하모가나 가서 하모가 디무리 제가 디파 제바제제 디세나 디기 수불 팽기레 디기 느기레서 비 예와체제 디 메인디 수불 팽기레서 하고 하다 디기 느기에서 하고나 디묵디 파매봐서 셰럽기 제바체제 메인디기 팽기도에 팽기면도 제바체네 디기 팽기레 디기 느기레서 하고 하거든 공메인공 뉴버디 응외니수도 하고 영도 하고 어디 제바치나 하고 어디 셰럽레 제가 메인기 뉴버디 응외니수디 팽기여나 느기여보다 하모가 되겠는데 디묵세오래 제가 된 하모고 디묵디 매봐서야라 제바체제 메인기 뉴병고 팽기여다 매데 제바체네 뉴버디 뭐 니수디 아니 그런 누가 가르치도 하고 하지 셰럽티 끼고래. 되네 셰럽티 끼바이나 하 먹어 여기 디무디 매가 자르고 그래. 제가 하 먹어 하지 맨디 누가 핑기에다면 하 먹어 하지 세샤바이나 안줄이야. 제수벌에 나서 다제 시에다 되니 영아 첨부요로. 제가 하 먹어 디무기 왕기 되네게 너트 몽골이고로. 제가 되네 빼로스 마선 디묵세 되네 우인이 수고를 맨 그런 누가 가르임 우인이서 하 먹어 간디 로들라 디묵시고래 되네기다 제바제제 아니 우인이 수기 뉴맹기 뉴바데 하고 간디 셰바들라 셰랍시고래 제가 되네기 셰랍디기 어디 맹기 뉴바 하모건 디무디 바세르고래 아주기 다 고디 우르시네 녀라
In the world, as well as in Buddhism, there are many different types of ignorance and therefore correspondingly many different types of wisdom. So for example, if we see a particular type of medication, whether that medication is suitable to heal our illness or not, this uncertainty, this not knowing, is a type of ignorance. Or if there's a particular food and we think to ourselves, is this healthy in general or not? That's ignorance. Or if we think, is this healthy for me or not? Will I have a reaction to this type of food or not? That too is a type of ignorance. Through investigating, we will be able to clear away that ignorance and we'll come to understand whether, for example, this medication will help us or not, through investigation. Through investigation, when we come to recognize that, yes, this medicine will help, or no, this medicine will not help, we are developing a wisdom, which is contrary to that ignorance. Through going through the process of investigation, we develop wisdom. And that wisdom is contrary to that type of ignorance and eliminates that type of ignorance. So this says through using our analytical consciousnesses and investigating, analyzing, that we develop wisdom and overcome the contrary type of ignorance.
디니기 디무기나네 쪼디 가르세네 당아지 나세 나세데 기디나 나솔 나세 나돌야 가르체베네 가르다 나세디 요로와다 제사데 나주게 나세디 니우이니 수간에 쉬어바디 나주게 하고 말해 하모가디다 나 가르치어서 나주게 나세디 풍부하다 제가라 뭐 그런 원에 유대바로시 능고래 니네게 나와나시 요래 삼지힌 루딜라 데 디묵시오래 디묵 다신 마리발라이 디묵래 아주 요몽바게 얘기다 dunga ya yu nyomo ba ye yu zo di le da jisan di me ba su ko le che jisan nga zo le nam yu de nga sa ji yo de di ne da nga di nga zo le na yu ka res dan ko res ne yu da ji phung bo la ga ya ma de ba phung bo la ma de ba ko rong wen ne ru ba na du go le na wa na xin di jin du ge de ti mu den da se ma ri pa se de da se ma ri ba ti mu sa cha go de nyomo bo ye yu zo di le da di me ba su ko le che da
The ignorance that keeps us bound in samsara is not an ignorance to do with medicine at all, but it's an ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in a way that's contrary to reality. It's an ignorance that believes that the self exists in a way that it does not. It's an ignorance that believes that phenomena such as the physical and mental aggregates exist in the way that they appear to the mind, exist in the way that we think about them. This ignorance is called the ignorance of self-grasping, because it grasps or believes that the self exists in the way that it appears to the mind when it does not. And this ignorance of self-grasping, is the root cause of all the afflicted minds. It's from grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not, that our attachment comes, our anger comes, resentment, jealousy, pride, all come. And this ignorance of self-grasping, the root of our samsara, is what we need to abandon.
Ganes pangugure labyo de dang zugi that Geshe Rabten yamne said the kugore chesa that da said anzu ya lo ya kan nang du samta da na yo de lo ya na du phung bo la ma de ba korong wen ye zu ba nang yo ba de ha go de de ge da de da che ba che che phung bo la ma de ba rang wen ye zu ba ji du ge min du che ba che ku che ba che yo de nan ga sam chi ya 풍보라 마디오 랑고인데 주바데 자오기 메바세 메바데 도고래 지사 메바데 하고 고래 지제데 하고도 다음에 봐도 be 시랍세 랑기 규랑 할 수도 있게와데 지사 디 다음에 봐도 be 시랍디 디 안에 야도 고묘도 되네 대시 다스 마리 파세디 고 메바주고 고 메바스에서나 안델야 되셔 콩도기야 요 말에 대대 콩로게메도 량한 바사메바 량한 바사메도 대대가 주기 동아지 풍보세야 요하메바 지도 동아도 유에 동아 차와두지 동아세 요하메바 되네 그디나 대와 땡이 대와세데 탈바세 토고래 대메바 소용도 제가 디메바 소야라 당한 주기 담메바 또 베셔랍세야 돼 대령님 실라송데 띵에스 디니 다 조디니 차고래
When Buddha Shakyamuni taught the Four Noble Truths in Varanasi, when he taught that true origins, the second noble truth, is what is to be abandoned, he was referring specifically to the ignorance of self-grasping as being the origin of all suffering, and therefore is the ignorance of self-grasping that is primarily to be abandoned. Moreover, he taught the path, the mental path that is to be cultivated in order to abandon the ignorance of self-grasping, the true origin, and that the true path that is to be cultivated in particular is the wisdom realizing selflessness. And how to develop this wisdom realizing selflessness? First, one needs to come to see how the self appears to the mind, and then investigate to see whether it exists in the way that it appears or not. And this is how one comes to understand reality, comes to understand that the self does not exist in the way that it appears at all. When one comes to realize selflessness, this is a consciousness of wisdom that is contrary to that ignorance. Through the cultivation of this wisdom and the elimination of the ignorance of self-grasping, there's no cause to give rise to the other afflictions, such as attachment or anger. Therefore, no contaminated karma is accumulated. Therefore, without any contaminated karma being accumulated, one becomes liberated from the resultant suffering. A cessation of suffering is achieved. The third noble truth, true cessation. So in order to achieve this, wisdom on the basis of concentration is required.
나 드네레 다 제사 드네 자다 상유 쯤는 디기 안줄이야 동화세야다 디기 주에게 탑람 어즈리 대바시 소야디 언도스레 다 드네잔 안주이나 디톨레야 되시 삼다의 셰바나 신신네 강토도 제화데 아주게 드네 제바 있나 나아주 디기 대화 주야다 디기 동화세 투에게 차고라 제사 드네시 신다 데려가시 샤샤나
That brings an end to the time that we have together. And this then was a brief presentation on what Buddha Shakyamuni taught in terms of how one can successfully achieve lasting, stable happiness, a state completely freed of suffering. The presentation on the Four Noble Truths. And we can take confidence that the being that was to become Buddha Shakyamuni was once an ordinary person just like us. And we too can train like he did in developing an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, abandoning true suffering, coming to know true sufferings, abandoning the origins of suffering in order to achieve true cessations, which are to be manifested, and it's done so through cultivating true paths. So this is what Buddha Shakyamuni did, and we too can do that. So thank you very much.